You can support me by turning on notifications, subscribing to my channel, and liking the video. Waiting for your comments. Unveiling the Nightmares, the disturbing origins behind our favorite fairy tales, might sound like a dramatic title for a horror collection, yet it points to an unsettling truth. Many of the cherished bedtime stories and animated classics we grew up adoring have roots that are far darker than their modern versions suggest. We often remember the delightful images of a princess awakening with a true love's kiss, or a whimsical band of talking animals aiding a kindly maiden in distress. Yet behind these bright, candy-colored retellings lies a history steeped in grim punishments, violent curses, and moral lessons forged in harsher times. Stripped of their sugarcoating, these tales can look more like horror vignettes than the gentle fables we associate with childhood. The reason is simple. Centuries ago, fairy tales weren't necessarily made for children. They were communal lore, cautionary narratives spun around fires to warn of life's perils. Consider Cinderella, widely known through the Disney lens, as the kindly girl whose glass slipper leads her to a royal wedding. However, if we delve back into the Brothers Grimm's account or older European variants, the stepsisters slice off parts of their feet to fit the glass slipper, leaving a trail of blood. Birds peck out their eyes at the story's end as retribution for their cruelty. While modern versions focus on the transformation of a pumpkin into a carriage and a happily ever after, the older telling is a macabre moral lesson on the consequences of envy. Indeed, the strong emphasis on grisly punishments was typical of the era. People found it more vivid, perhaps, to illustrate wrongdoing by savage comeuppance. That detail alone is enough to startle those who think of Cinderella as a benign tale of dresses and magic. Then there's Snow White, famed for its gentle dwarf companions, and a poisoned apple that prompts the heroine's deep sleep. The real shock emerges in many older renditions. The evil queen, sometimes the mother, not a stepmother, demands the huntsman return with Snow White's lungs and liver, intending to consume them. The undertone of cannibalism doesn't appear in mainstream retellings, obviously, but it epitomizes how earlier cultures embedded savage elements into stories. Meanwhile, the queen is ultimately forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she collapses in a grotesque finale that dwarfs the Disney depiction of her plunging from a cliff. The impetus behind these violent endings was a stark moral clarity. Evil must be punished brutally. Children hearing them in medieval times might well have been traumatized, but they also learned to avoid envy or malice if they didn't want to suffer a horrifying fate. The Little Mermaid, too, has a raw heartbreak absent from its sanitized retelling. Hans Christian Andersen's original version sees the mermaid endure excruciating pain with every step on her newly formed legs, only to fail in winning the prince's love. As dawn breaks, she dissolves into sea foam. No triumphant wedding scene or bright singing animals, just the lesson that sacrifice for unrequited love can end in tragedy. Scholars debate whether Andersen's personal grief over unrequited affections influenced that sorrowful ending. Regardless, the grim result stands in stark contrast to the cheerful resolution so many of us recall. The old moral, that love can demand agony without reward, resonates far more darkly than the modern happily ever after. Yet maybe one of the most startling stories is that of Sleeping Beauty. While the Disney film leans on curses, spindles, and a life-saving kiss, older variations, like Giambattista Basil's Sun, Moon, and Talia, tell a far more harrowing tale. The sleeping maiden is violated by a passing king and awakens only when she's birthed twins who suck the flax from her finger. The paternal figure later attempts to murder the infants so his jealous wife can devour them, though the plan is thwarted. This appalling plot shows how early fairy tales often contained adult themes of violence, betrayal, and forced marriage. Modern editors and retellers tone down these details significantly for their child audiences, leaving behind a sanitized dreamscape. Why, though, were these narratives so brutal? For one, many hail from epochs rife with plagues, wars, and scarcity. They served as cautionary frameworks. If you behave cruelly, unspeakable things could happen, or steer clear of strangers, or you risk abduction or worse. The graphic punishments hammered home the moral. Also, in times when reading was rare, oral tradition thrived on shocking imagery. People remembered stories more vividly when they involved dramatic, often gory twists. Over generations, authors like Perrault or the Brothers Grimm started collecting and refining these tales for publication. But even the Grimm's early editions retained savage elements that later versions toned down. As fairy tales wove into Victorian sensibilities and then Walt Disney's era, commercial appeal demanded kinder story arcs. The darkest aspects were trimmed or disguised. Meanwhile, lesser-known stories remain overshadowed by their popular cousins, yet hold equally grim twists. Bluebeard is hardly a cuddly bedtime read, showcasing a nobleman who murders multiple wives for their curiosity, displaying their corpses in a locked chamber. Rumpelstiltskin or the Pied Piper also carry menacing layers if we look closer. The Pied Piper's disappearance of all the town's children, a chilling mass kidnapping, speaks to how the line between fable and horror was wafer thin. People needed these cautionary tales to express communal anxieties, betrayal by leaders, dangerous strangers, or the perils of greed. Fairy tales thus serve dual roles, entertaining and warning, forging moral order through shock value. Today's cinematic or storybook renditions often reflect only a fraction of these complexities. The dwarfs in Snow White have comedic personalities. Cinderella's stepsisters merely tear up her dress, and the Little Mermaid marries the prince. We might be grateful that children aren't subjected to nightmarish punishments or cannibalistic feasts. However, a growing audience finds fascination in learning the original forms. It reminds us that these were never just whimsical fantasies, but living relics of how past societies confronted life's brutality. And in many ways, that brutal honesty underscores the resilience of the human spirit, reflecting hope amid despair or shining a light on the darkest corners of human behavior. Consider also the phenomenon of Beauty and the Beast, a fairy tale often cited for its gentle moral about inner worth. In early incarnations, the concept of a beastly bridegroom underscores forced marriage or captivity. The monstrous exterior can symbolize not just bestial appearance, but the raw fear of being sold into union with a stranger. By modern standards, the story can evoke discussions of Stockholm Syndrome. Yet older societies saw it as a necessary lesson on acceptance or the complexities of arranged marriage. Our favorite childhood love story thus harbors undertones of dread and compromise if we sift through the layered symbolism. Even Rapunzel deals with imprisonment, forced isolation, and a scoring conclusion. The prince blinds himself in a thorn bush after a fall. The subsequent reunion is joyous, but only after that surge of pain. We rarely dwell on that grim detail in contemporary retellings, focusing instead on the romance of Rapunzel's liberation from her tower. The tower stands as a metaphor for how young women were sometimes sheltered or confined, while the story's painful consequences highlight the cost of escape. The old formula seems consistent. Tragedy or hardship must come before a possible redemption, reflecting moral codes of the time. Some academics argue these grim origins keep fairy tales tethered to real emotional stakes, preventing them from drifting into hollow fantasies. By confronting darkness, the stories can deliver more profound lessons. The sanitized versions, while delightful, risk losing that potent mixture of caution and catharsis. For instance, letting children know that adversity can be harrowing, that wickedness can be truly vile, might help them grapple with harsh realities in smaller, controlled doses, though that perspective remains debated among educators and parents. It's worth noting that not all original tales were purely gory or sadistic. Some centered on clever tricksters or wise older figures who rescue the oppressed through cunning. Yet the overwhelming tone often skewed dark. Perhaps it was a way for communities to handle primal fears, disease, famine, betrayal, violence by embedding them in narrative form. People would gather, share these stories, and emerge feeling that despite monstrous forces, the potential for heroism or moral equilibrium remained. Today, the grim side of fairy tales has found new fans in adults seeking deeper or spookier storylines. Popular shows or films sometimes revert to the original twists, marketing them as the real story behind your childhood favorite. This revitalization speaks to an eternal human craving for layered tales that blend horror, wonder, and moral clarity. The same reason older societies consumed these raw fables is why modern audiences are intrigued by them. They address universal themes like fear, betrayal, redemption, and love in hyper-vivid style. So the next time you watch a luminous, sweet adaptation of a well-known fairy tale, remember the possibility that behind the scenes once lurked severed toes, devoured organs, or twisted curses. A cheery princess might have endured tragic heartbreak. A comical dwarf storyline might mask savage endings. This knowledge doesn't have to tarnish our enjoyment of modern retellings, but it can enrich our perspective. We see how culture evolves, how narratives adapt to each era's sensibilities, and how ancient moral codes demanded fierce retribution. Fairy tales remain ever-shifting cultural mirrors, reflecting the dilemmas and values we carry. In the end, unveiling the nightmares, the disturbing origins behind our favorite fairy tales, is less about tearing down the comforting narratives we've embraced, and more about showcasing how these stories are vibrant, ancient tapestries woven from life's greatest extremes: love, cruelty, sacrifice, triumph. By acknowledging their grim ancestry, we reconnect with the raw spirit that once made them vital survival lessons. Even if modern audiences prefer gentler versions, a fascination with the shadowy corners persists, ensuring these tales continue to captivate. After all, each sweet happily ever after can shine even brighter when we appreciate the dark labyrinth from which it emerged.